lepers, Levitical laws, Jesus, and today's church. If you want to find out more, then stick around for our conversation. And welcome to Past the Pulpit, where we dive in beyond the sermon to look at life, love, faith, and community. Each week we ask the preaching test what hopes, challenges, and passions lie at the heart of the sermon. Welcome to episode 7, Be Made Clean, from our Every Word series. Today I am with Pastor Raewyn Orlich, which I just found out is Orlich after almost 2 years, not Orlick. I apologize officially. And we're going to sit together and discuss Jesus' words found in the book of Luke, chapter 5, verse 12 to 15. You can find the sermon on the YouTube channel if you want to pop over to La Sierra University Church. And that's what this conversation is rooted in. Hey, Raewyn, how are we doing today?
Good. Great.
All right. We ready to go?
Yes. Once when he was in one of the cities, a man covered with a skin disease was there. When he saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Then Jesus stretched out his hand, touched him, and said, "I am willing, be made clean." Immediately the skin disease left him, and he ordered him to tell no one. "But go show yourself to the priest, and, as Moses commanded, make an offering for your cleansing as a testimony to them." But now more than ever, the word about Jesus spread abroad. Many crowds were gathering to hear him and to be cured of their diseases. Meanwhile, he would slip away to deserted places and pray.
That is a great story. Maybe to fill in the whole picture, we should go ahead and read some Leviticus on the rules and laws of a leper. From Leviticus chapter 13, we need to know the context of lepers in Jesus' day.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "When a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a defiling disease on the skin of his body, he shall be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons the priests. The priest will examine the disease on the skin of his body, and if the hair in the diseased area has turned white and the disease appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a defiling disease. After the priest has examined him, he shall pronounce him unclean."
So in our story here in Luke, we can see why Jesus would send him to the priest.
Yeah.
Because the priest, it's not the doctor, it's the priest that deems someone clean, right?
Right.
If the leper is deemed clean, what happens to the leper?
He can rejoin community.
He can be part of the community again. Yeah. And obviously, if he can't, he's kind of banished out, right?
The person who has the defiling disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head be disheveled. And he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp.
Oh, man, he shall dwell alone. Can we talk about loneliness today?
Yeah.
Who are our lepers today? Who do we see that deal with being marginalized because of their predicament?
First thing that comes to my mind are our friends without homes.
Yes.
That are many times living alone.
Yeah.
Many times people, I myself, want to look away, don't want to make contact, human touch, isolated. I would say invisible. However, in the text here, when they see others, they've got to shout out unclean. Could you imagine? Yeah.
Knowing your brokenness and still having to proclaim it out loud to the rest of the world.
Yeah, don't touch me. Yeah.
Not to be touched, not to be cared for.
Yeah. Going through the COVID epidemic, the height of it, made this come alive a lot more for me. Just how sensitive we are now about coughing or, all of this. And so, if we're wearing a mask, often we're like, okay, I'm masking, I'm sick or I'm not sick. We want to declare, right, clean or unclean to the people around us so that they know if we're contagious or not. This is a very early way of community trying to limit spread of disease, right? Yeah. Before the vaccine was widely available, there was a hospital in the area that was needing more chaplain support. Yeah. And basically they contacted pastors to say, if you come and visit people, be a chaplain with us, we'll give you the vaccine. So myself and some of the others on your pastoral team, we went and got vaccinated, and then we're visiting people in that setting. And it wasn't necessarily COVID patients, because at that time it was still very limited and isolated. But we'd visit people in general needed care and visitation, and but I remember on the wards they would put up a sign that said clean, or a sign that said not clean. And what those were COVID wards and not COVID wards at the time. And it struck me, clean, unclean. We don't really use those kind of religious categories anymore. In Leviticus, it's throughout the Leviticus, including when women have their menstrual cycle.
That's right.
You're unclean. And you're not supposed to touch anyone and all of that. We don't, since Christ, thank goodness we don't have the ceremonial laws.
There's not little tents outside of each city filled with ladies here and lepers there. Yeah.
So we don't have that religious impurity as a physical thing that with the temple sacrifice system and all of that's all no longer. And yet we still have these deeply human ways of relating to people and a sense of clean or unclean. And that's tricky.
Going back to the pandemic, it was understandable for me that there were some who had a difficult time with the mandate that many of us should not mingle with each other, right? Like stay isolated, stay in your home. And there were many people who didn't. And I could understand why, because loneliness is a bitter thing. To be isolated and to have no connection for the people you love. And it's a little bit different for people who come from tribal spaces. Because it's especially communal there. It's multi-generational, right? So like having to all of a sudden not be able to see your parents or your grandparents, it's an impossibility. I can only imagine how impossible it is for the biblical families who live in these kind of multi-generational, big communal families to all of a sudden not be able to be around that. And you have to go out. And the shame of saying, during the pandemic, if you coughed once, man, everybody was like, You remember that? And you'd have to be like, no, I'm not sick. And everybody's like, yeah, you are. You're just lying to us. Could you imagine like the angst that some of these individuals were feeling? Especially this leper here.
And to not have any hope of anything else, to have leprosy and there be no cure. And that's just what it is. Like in the sequence of things, once the priest declared you unclean, Leviticus doesn't really, it says get examined by the priest, but in what we read, it's not really saying, oh yeah, one day if you no longer have these sores, come back and get re-examined. No, it's, okay, you get examined, then 7 days, okay, it's okay, it gone away, all right? So you're clean. And then if it comes up again, you have to go back. But once you're unclean and living alone and outside the camp, there's not like, oh, go back and check in with the priest again.
You're done.
Yeah, that's it.
That's a wrap. Well, let's pull back in here to Luke chapter 5. There's a leper. He comes face down to the ground and begged, Lord, if you choose, you can make me clean. And then Jesus stretched out his hand, touched him, and said, I do choose, be made clean. Whoa. Yeah. We've just got done talking about how important it is for the people not to touch a leper, the uncleanliness, you're out of the community. And the first thing it says about Jesus is he reaches out to touch him.
Yeah, that is beautiful. Yeah, and if you touch someone that's unclean, you would be unclean.
Yeah, you would be considered unclean. Whether or not it affected you in any way, just touching them would put you in the category of unclean.
Yeah, and Jesus wasn't afraid to be considered unclean.
Ooh.
To touch him.
There's some gospel power there.
Yeah.
How many of us Christians are afraid to be in the category of unclean.
Yes.
So we don't reach out to people we need to be reaching towards.
Right.
Because we don't want them to be saying, well, I saw him talking to that person. So,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Or,
that's right.
oh, she was reaching out to them and, oh, so she must be.
That's right.
I don't know. I've heard there's been articles written about all kinds of people in the world for
Yes,
for
that's
being,
right.
for being too willing to touch the lives of others.
Yes. So I read a book called The Righteous Mind.
Right.
And in that book, it's really interesting. He talks about moral philosophy, and there's 5 foundations of morality that you see across cultures and people groups. And most people relate more to some of them than others, but it tends to be part of your moral framework of like what's right and what's wrong.
Right.
And so one of them is this purity, sanctity thing. So is it pure? Is it pure? And this is probably where a lot of the clean and unclean conceptions came from. Is something pure?
Yeah.
Or is it not pure? And yeah, even though we don't have those categories in an official religious sense, we have them in our core.
Oh, yeah.
And so Jesus stepping beyond that and showing us a different way forward, that it's not your purity that matters, but the touch of God.
Whoa.
Is a big deal.
That's a big deal. Could you imagine what the disciples were going through when Jesus does this? Like, I'm surprised Luke didn't write in there that somebody yelled at Jesus, hey, don't do it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Oh, and I would have been scared for Jesus too. But say, hey, you're going to get leprosy. Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
And there are risks involved.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
When we cross boundaries, when we touch people that others say you shouldn't.
Yeah.
Right. There's sometimes very real. There are perceived risks, and then there are additional risks. I just think about that story. There was a movie, The End of the Spear.
Oh yeah,
Elliot.
that's right.
Elliot,
Yeah.
Jim Elliot, who went to a tribe that had not yet heard about the story of Jesus, and he died. He was a martyr, taking that risk, like crossing a boundary. And then I think too about the clean and unclean with Cornelius and Peter, and that vision he has with all the food coming down, and God saying, eat. And he's saying, no, I don't eat that stuff. And God saying, eat. No, I don't. And then later on, he says, he goes to Cornelius, the Gentiles' house, right? He's with people who are unclean.
Right.
So not only do you have people with skin diseases that are unclean in Jewish society, but all the people who are not Jewish are also unclean.
The Gentiles.
Yeah. And Peter says, I've learned not to call unclean what God has made clean.
Ooh, that's a word. Wow. And I think it's so timely for our world today. People of faith have become us versus them.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the church, but it's a reflection of the way that the world works around us. And instead of reflecting how the kingdom should work, I think we often gravitate towards what is happening in the larger context of our world. And we've kind of drawn these lines on what we believe is pure and what is not pure.
Yeah.
We've been doing this forever. I mean, if you think back, there's like all kinds of examples. If you don't wear a suit to church, people look at you as if you're unclean.
Yeah.
If you come to church with a tattoo, this is like the 90s and the 80s. If you come to a tattoo, if you get divorced, this was early 90s. You're considered unclean. And we just find new versions or iterations of this and how we can judge others to somehow keep ourselves pure. What powerful insight are you hearing from the text, Raewyn, that we haven't touched on yet?
There's these few words that get exchanged between the leper and Jesus, this willingness, if you are willing.
Right.
To me, that speaks a lot about who we believe God to be.
Ooh.
So he's asking Jesus, if you are willing, you can make me clean. He's like, Jesus, I know you have the power. He's saying, it's a statement of faith, right?
Yeah.
I know you can do this, but do you want to? Are you willing to do it? And then Jesus says, I am willing. I am willing, be made clean. I want to do that. So, and that willing, I think it also is that question of, what is God's character?
Yeah.
What does God want in the world? What is God's will in the world?
Yeah.
What is God willing in the world? And then am I willing to be a part of that?
There it is. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah.
How does it reflect on my willingness to live out the agency of kingdom life here? The question isn't, am I able to? The question is, am I willing to?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we're like, well, we want to help people, but, we just don't have the time. Or when my life is all right, when I finally get married, or when I finally kids move out, I can finally. And I think the question isn't, am I able to, but am I willing to?
Yeah.
Am I willing to love and live as God does? Because what happens is when Jesus heals this leper, the leper is able to have community again.
Yeah.
And when we're willing to be so radical like Christ, to touch the lives of those around us who've been marginalized, they get to have community again.
Yeah.
Isn't that the work of the church?
Amen.
I
Yeah.
feel like that's what we should be doing, as opposed to saying you're not good enough or you don't meet the recommendations or the qualifications of being a part of the saved.
Right.
We should be saying, I want to reach out to you that you might recognize you are a part of the saved.
Yeah.
That God is doing something good here.
And am I willing to let my own purity be questioned
Ooh, come on now.
because of following Jesus
Yeah.
in reaching out to those that have been labeled unclean?
Yeah. I've received a few letters myself over the years of ministry from almost every assignment I've been in.
Yeah.
Someone with the heart of gold will write me a letter, and say, I hear you doing this with these groups of people, and I hear you doing that in the community. And I just, out of love, I just want you to know that we're praying for you, that you don't get lost.
Yeah.
And I just think to myself, wow, I think it's a task of a pastor in a church community to be reaching out and not worrying about what other people are going to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you experienced that?
Oh, yes, definitely. And
Welcome to A Pastor's Life, if
Yeah.
you're listening.
yeah, definitely. And sometimes it comes from people that care about you and are worried for you.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe for all of us, because it can come from people that we trust.
Yes.
That they appreciate what we're doing. We think that's the right thing, but they're worried that we're going to get hurt in the process of having these relationships or reaching out in that way that Jesus does. And I get that because it is a risk. And yet Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. So we're called to live a life of risk as followers of Jesus. We're called to go places where other people would not want to go.
Wow.
And that's part of it. And so I think if we're following Jesus, he's going to take us to places that cross boundaries, and places that people would consider unclean, because that's what Jesus did. He came to this earth and to be with all of us. He calls us to follow him.
I can't think of any biblical activity where Jesus was involved where it didn't have to do with reaching across a boundary that didn't offend somebody.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think in my head. Maybe Nicodemus and him, but that was in the night, right? But every relational experience that we read about with Jesus has to do with crossing a line with his children, whether it's the Syrophoenician woman, it's the bleeding woman, it's the woman who comes in and washes her hair with, Jesus' feet, Lazarus. There's the Sychar with the Samaritan woman. I can't think of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe it helps us when we're receiving critique or concern to just think about this story and think about the people in the crowd and the disciples who say, no, Jesus, don't do it. And that people have good hearts when they're doing that. They're worried about the purity and cleanliness and that you're going to get hurt or maybe the church will get hurt or something will happen. And to recognize that most of the time these critiques are coming from people with good hearts, who are well-intentioned. And can we be those people sometimes?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's good.
To say, hey, we're those people, we look at someone else's ministry.
Yeah.
And we're like, what are they doing?
Ray,
They
when you
need to
cut
stop.
me deep. Oh, that's so good. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right.
So be a little bit less quick to critique.
Wow, that's really good. That's really good. Fear is such a powerful motivator. And sometimes when we're driven by it, we are protective because of the fear that surrounds it. Growing up in an immigrant home, my mother was very protective, and she ruled with a lot of, not anger, but like very like staunch, very strong. And I didn't understand it when we were younger, but as I got older, I realized, we grew up and there were tough situations, and it could have very likely been life threatening. And that's why my mother was so strong and so harsh on us. Not because she was angry, but because she was scared for us.
Yeah.
That fear in our loved ones and anyone can really cause us to pull back and tighten up.
Don't reach out.
Yeah, because it's scary. It really is. Jesus is reaching out and is about to touch a leper, which could be a life-transforming thing for Jesus. And what happens, Jesus, what happens to your ministry?
Yeah.
What happens if you get leper? What happens if you die now? What happens to all of us?
Yeah,
who are
for this
following?
one person, is it worth it?
One person is really worth it.
Yeah.
And yet, he does it.
Yeah. And we're talking about it 2,000 years ago.
Hey.
I mean, later.
Yeah, we are. Okay, let's wrap up a little bit here. What do we hope for those listening along? For you, thank you, by the way, if you're listening and you're on your drive or you're cleaning your house or you're watching your kids, and you shouldn't be listening to us, but listening to them. Thanks for tuning in. As we land this plane around the idea of Jesus touching this leper, and we're going to preach on this text, what is the hope for those who sit in our pews or who's driving their car and listening in? Raewyn, what would you say? Where's our gem here?
Yeah, I really am struck for myself and for our listeners today of that need to be willing. God, make me willing. God, make me willing to go to places that I'm not comfortable.
Yeah.
For the sake of community, for the sake of someone that needs encouraging word, needs a touch.
Yeah.
That I would follow Jesus in that, to be willing to reach out.
For the sake of healing.
Yeah.
For the sake of restoring community and reconciliation.
Yes.
And
that's
all
good.
that at the sake of maybe others talking about us.
Yeah.
That it's okay. We can let other people say things, because our task is not to listen to the chatter, but to touch the soul.
Yeah.
Well, if you happen to be driving along and you're thinking about someone you should reconcile with, or maybe a radical way of caring and loving your community that you're afraid others may say something, don't be afraid. Jesus reached out and touched the leper and brought him back into the community. We can do the hard work of reaching out to those who are marginalized around us and bless them and love them. Until we catch up at episode 8, thanks for listening with us. This has been Past the Pulpit. Raewyn, you got any final words for us before we close?
Be well.
Be well, friends. Be well. And it's a wrap.